Welcome to Why Study Logic and Critical Thinking. This is Lecture 1 for Phil 10, Critical Thinking at Penn State Berks. My name is Dr. Stephen Bujno. Our first lecture here in this course on critical thinking is just going to lay out the groundwork, exactly what it is that we're going to study, and then we'll talk briefly about what you soon will come to know as the three acts of the mind. Now, it's been my understanding, at least from students I've had in the past, that logic isn't something that's entirely difficult, but it is in many ways different for some people, so then it appears difficult. These lectures are not necessarily standalone lectures. In other words, they're going to be things that I intend to augment once we're in the classroom, but these are a good introduction to the readings that you had, and also over the course of some time teaching this, I've learned that there are certain aspects that are more difficult, not perhaps to apprehend, or don't appear clear when you first read them. So listening through to a lecture like this often helps in that regard. At the very basic level, we either spend time thinking about how we think or we do not think about how we think. And that's not meant to be clever. There's a book by Mortimer Adler that's entitled How to Read a Book. And for somebody who knows how to physically read, could put together a sentence structure and knows the alphabet and such, that might seem to be odd. But there are strategies to reading that makes comprehension much easier. So even though we all think, we may not all think well. So a course like this is designed to help us find not just ways to do it, but ways to do it in a fashion that's going to lead us to particular truths that we want to discover. So in a very real sense, logic is a tool of the wise. Logic is not philosophy, but it is a tool of philosophy. So if philosophy is the love of wisdom and logic is a tool of philosophy, then therefore logic is a tool of the wise. Real quick syllogism there. Now, in our particular culture, and it's nothing unique to our time, oftentimes those people who are thought to have won an argument or a discussion are those who simply get the most angry about a thing. So what determines whether or not it's a valid argument, or we're calling here the veracity of an argument, is often determined by their level of outrage. Sometimes we also think that as long as they're sincere about what they're saying, that there must be a truth behind it. Now, because they're upset or because they're sincere doesn't mean that it's not true, but that's also not what determines the truth of such a thing. Often in our world, we will find individuals who hold fast to an ideology. An ideology is a belief that is, we would say, non-epistemic. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. How does one come to know? If a person holds a particular belief, opinion, or position that really is not formed well, but yet they hold on to it, we would call them ideologues. And ideologues hold on to an ideology. This could be many things. Oftentimes in politics, people will hold a particular position that may or may not be necessarily true. They might also hold that towards other aspects of worldviews that they form and then becomes part of how they see all other things. Nonetheless, we're going to try to work around all of that and really, in a sense, put it to the side so that we can see things as they are. We'll get to that more in the second lecture. But let's say right up front that we'll define logic as the systematic study of judging and reasoning in order to arrive at a particular truth. So this is one of these, we would even say, a natural inclination for us that we all want truth. We're always trying to figure it out. Is that a lie or is that true? Are you serious? That type of thing. It's not something that any of us has to learn to desire. It's just something that each of us has to learn to do well. Now, the one thing that I could say, well, let's say two things that I believe will come out of a course like this is it's unlikely that you're going to be satisfied watching the news. Well, I know it's unlikely you're satisfied watching the news now, but this won't be out of frustration. It's going to be because you're going to ferret out what the arguments are and you're going to realize that you're not really being informed. And also, you probably will start being a little more nitpicky when people talk, and that could be a little disruptive. So, but nonetheless, it's because you're always trying to understand well, and you tend to ask a lot of questions. Now, that aside, the positive aspects is because logic is after a truth and not to win an argument by being angry or sincere, it does at least give us a premise for becoming good listeners, because the goal is, what is it that's being said? And on the reverse, when other people are listening to us, hopefully that we will be very clear in what we are saying, because we're so interested in relaying the truth that we understand, that we find good ways to articulate that. So listening and articulation are positive aspects that come out of this. Now, these are not negative aspects, but these are things I would say that almost is in a colloquial way a superpower. You become very defensive in the sense that when something is not said correctly, you will gain the ability to recognize and identify what it is exactly that is an error of what you're hearing. Now, we can't know everything about all subjects. So, in other words, logic does not make a person an expert in all the things. And I should say up front that studying logic doesn't make us smarter than anybody. It might just make us more aware. But to be honest, that's more humbling than it is prideful, because you realize how difficult sometimes it is to relay the truth in what you're saying yourself, and then you recognize that that could also be the case for others. But nonetheless, when you're watching a particular news program or an advertisement comes on TV, you're going to start being able to recognize and identify exactly what are the fallacies, what's the strength or the weaknesses in their arguments and such. And that's a good thing. And it's also not going to allow us to fall prey to these fallacies or to be, sucked into some sort of ideology or, worse yet, propaganda. So in other words, if we're watching a commercial about a professional basketball player that is promoting a particular type of sneaker, right off the bat, we sort of know that doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, I'm not going to wear that sneaker and then be as good as the basketball player. But studying logic and critical thinking, you're going to recognize that as an A proposition, that, basketball player X wears these shoes. And you're going to also know that you simply cannot convert that so that by you wearing your shoes, you're going to be like that basketball player. So rather than just knowing that it doesn't make sense, you're going to call that the improper conversion of an A proposition. It's also going to let you have a certain resiliency to not getting sucked into advertising. In other words, being sold something that we don't want. It's one thing when advertisers will let you know where maybe the closest place to get good pizza is. It's another thing whether or not what that pizza is of value to you. This is just a way for us to work through this and hopefully get to the truth. That's always the goal in this. Now, I said there was 3 acts of the mind. According to Aristotle, the first act of the mind is what's known as simple apprehension. Now, simple apprehension always ends in a term. A term could be a word, or a term could be a phrase or a group of words. And there are many qualities to terms. We're just going to cover 3 of them. A term has to either be, or could be, either exact or vague. So when we say something like, well, that building is tall, the term tall is not exact. We're not really sure what that means. Is it tall than other buildings? Is it taller because of the town that we live in doesn't have many tall buildings? Or are we in a city where tall has a whole different understanding? So the way to overcome something like this, to go from the vague word tall to an exact, would say that building is 12 stories. We roughly know what a story is, so now we have something to quantify that, we should say. Also, terms can be unambiguous or they can be ambiguous. Now, this has a lot of different ways to express it. Here I'm expressing it with a term that's equivocating. So if one were to say the candidate is running, now maybe in the context we realize he's or she is running for a particular office, but we don't know. Sometimes for publicity purposes, the candidates go out jogging, so somebody might say the candidate is running. So the way to do this is just to qualify it, right? The candidate is running for office, the candidate is running for exercise, something like that. But the less ambiguous that we are, the better we can have an understanding of that particular term. And terms can also be clear or unclear. So If we were to say, well, this device that they're using is a sphygmomanometer, that's a very clear term, but it's only clear if you understand what that term is. It would be like, say, in a furnace, when you burn oil and use oxygen and stuff, you might say, well, the atmosphere is stoichiometric. That too is a very clear term, but it's only clear if you understand it. So, in a sense, clarity resides in the hearer, but it's up to us to make sure that we're using terms that are clear for the person who's hearing us, because the whole goal here is so that they can apprehend exactly what it is that we're saying. In the end, we want our terms, as best as they could be, to be exact, unambiguous, and clear. That's the goal. Now, the second act of the mind is forming a judgment. Now, we're going to do this through propositions. A proposition, in particularly what we'll be looking at mostly, are declarative sentences. So these propositions have some level of truth or falsity, depending on what it is that we're saying. Now, we often just use normal speech. We're going to look and call that standard speech, but we're going to look at how that then is put into logical form. Now, we would not diagram this, obviously, on paper every time somebody speaks, but in our minds we're doing this. And if we can't put it into logical form, as we'll see, we may not be exactly certain what that individual is trying to say, especially if there's some issue with the terms. So, here's a standard sentence. Somebody might say, everyone needs joy in life. We would have to figure out exactly what the meaning, and the logical form would be we're going to have to put it into first a subject, and then and then a predicate. So we would be meaning by that all those who are living, the TW could be those who or that which, so all those who are living persons are those who need joy. Now, these particular propositions have parts. The first part is the quantifier. It's to what extent are we talking about? All of them, none of them, or some of them. So those are our options there. The subject, or those who are living persons. The predicate, those who need joy. And the copula is the thing that connects those two. The copula could be is or are, or it could be is not or are not. So when someone says to us, everyone needs joy in life, in our minds, we're working out, well, all those who are living persons are those who need joy. Now, if we're not certain what they mean by that, then we're going to have to try to start asking some questions. Here's another one. If somebody were to say, nothing is needed in life except joy. Now, off the bat, you're probably thinking the first one seems to work. That sounds right to us. Everyone needs joy in life. Now, but the second standard proposition, nothing is needed in life except joy, that doesn't quite ring true. Now, we'd put that into logical form by saying all that which is necessary for living persons is that which is joy. So we have some issues right off the bat here. First off is that we're not quite sure what the word needs means in either case, right? So we sort of accept, everyone needs joy in life because we're understanding needs in here as maybe wants or should have or is best. But it's not needs in the sense that without this, it's impossible. So we would not think that they are saying that life is impossible unless you have joy. We would like to say that life is better or life should be such that we have joy. So you could also see here just how the term itself can sort of throw us off on that. But nonetheless, so this is how we would take something from a standard phrase and then put it into a logical form. And then we would at least at this point be able to go back and ask the individual, are you saying that all that which is necessary for living persons is that which is joy? If they say, well, yes, that's what I mean, then we can go after and try to determine the truth of that particular statement. And if they say, no, that's not what I mean is this, well, then we don't have to play gotcha. At that point, we can at least be thankful that we're working out what particularly that individual is saying and try to get to the bottom of it. But on its surface, we probably would ascribe truth to the first one. Yeah, okay, as long as we understand needs as wants or should have or as best, yes, everybody needs joy in their life, should have joy in their life. True. Is it the only thing we need? No. We're going to say that's false. this may be obvious to you, but we'll see later, perhaps not in this lecture, how we might work something like that out. Now, the third act of the mind is what's typically known as discursive reasoning. So we go from terms to judgments, and terms are all built on what we would say the superapprehension, and then the judgments are always ending in propositions, and reasoning is always ending in arguments. And unlike propositions that are true and false, arguments have validity or invalidity, and we determine whether or not they are strong or whether or not they are weak. Validity and invalidity are only for deductive arguments. When we talk about strong or weak, those would be inductive. So inductive would go from the specific to the general, and deductive from the general to the specific. So when you hear Sherlock Holmes saying, purely deduction, my dear Watson, he's actually talking about induction. That's a little bit of an aside. So let's say something in a deductive form off of what we used in the previous slide. Everyone needs joy in their life. If we're going to break this into its argument, an argument is going to be a syllogism, and we're going to work through a minor premise, a major premise, and then form a conclusion. So our minor premise is, all those who seek what is needed for a living are those who need joy. Our major premise would be, all those who are living persons are that which is needed for living. The conclusion, it's always, the therefore is the most common one here. Therefore, all those who are living persons are those who need joy. So our sentence in a standard form was, everyone needs joy in life. That's the conclusion. We're trying to figure out, how did that person get there? So the way that we see this is that each of those, the subject, those who are living persons, and the predicate, those who need joy, are pulled off of premises that have not been spoken. So we often talk maybe in just two sentences to bring to our conclusion. We don't talk in pure syllogistic form. That would be a little robotic for all of us. So what you see here is the subject in the major premise, that becomes the subject in our conclusion, all those who are living persons. The predicate in the minor premise becomes the predicate in our conclusion, those who need joy. But there has to be something that connects those things, something that's common. That's known as the middle term, okay? So you see, those who seek what is needed for a living, that's a term, even though it's not a word, it's a phrase, that's a middle term. So the subject in the minor premise and the predicate in the major premise, those things are identical. You take out the middle term, and then what you're left with is your conclusion. Now, if this is your first hearing of something like this, it probably sounds confusing and perhaps not quite clear to you. We're going to work through these a lot, and there's a lot of different ways that we could present this. I'm trying to do it in what I would say is the simplest fashion to see it. It's one thing hearing it for the first time, it's another thing having a chance to just talk about it, and we'll certainly do that in the classroom. Now, here's how this works. If the minor premise is true, if it is true that all those who seek what is needed for living are those who need joy, and if it is true that all those who are living persons are those who seek what is needed for living, then that conclusion is valid. If somebody says, I accept your minor and major premise, of course they're not going to talk like that, but if they say, I accept those first two sentences that you've spoken, they have to accept the conclusion. If they don't accept the conclusion, then they're simply just being obstinate. So an argument always works through premises to a conclusion, and it's provided that you accept the premises, the conclusion just logically follows from that. Now, there are problems that arise here, specifically. It could be problems in the formal logic or the informal logic or the weakness of terms and such, but under any normal circumstances, the argument is this syllogism. The conclusion is the final truth that you're working out, and it's based and premised off those first two major and minor propositions and such. Now, in inductive argument, we might say, instead of, everybody needs joy in life, it might just be that we know a lot of people who have joy that live around us. So let's put something into just standard form here. Everyone where I live needs joy in their life. See, so now we're starting with a specific. We're not starting from the general coming down. We're starting with specific, and then we're trying to make a conclusion from that. Now, the premise one would be, I've met almost all the people where I live. Let's just say in my neighborhood. Premise two, I've never met anybody where I live that does not need joy in their life. Well, if you accept those two things, therefore, all people where I live must need joy in their life. Now, rather than this being valid, because we're not working through a deduction, we're going to say that if premise 1 and 2 are true, if you have met almost everybody where you live, and if you've never met anybody where you live that does not need joy in their life, then we can say that your conclusion, therefore all people where I live must need joy in their life, is a very strong conclusion. So the difference here is that we are talking about the strength or the weakness of an argument when it's inductive, and when it's deductive, we're talking about the validity or the invalidity of something. So in your text, there was a really nice diagram. I'm not going to try to explain it here, but it branches down, and it shows you that if we're talking about something that perhaps is a deductive on the left side, to valid or invalid. Now, we didn't talk about sound or unsound, but if all the because there could be validity where your conclusion works logically from the first two premises, but there's something wrong in one of the premises. We'll talk about that another day. That would have a valid conclusion, but if one of your major or minor premises are wrong, it's an unsound argument. It would be, like here would be an example, just so you know what I'm talking about. If I were to say, all things that are green are grass, well, I see that over there, and that's green, therefore it must be grass. That's a valid argument, but we would not accept the premise that everything that's green is grass. We might say everything that's grass is green, but we wouldn't say everything that is green is grass. So even though the argument would work out validly, it simply would not be a sound conclusion. And then as far as the inductive argument, strong or weak, same thing there. If one of the premises were not true, like you really have not met all the people where you live, then even though it seems sort of that there's strong, it's a bad inductive argument because one of your premises does not follow. So I hope this was just a little bit of an eye-opener, a really brief introduction into what we're going to be studying. We'll slowly work through each of these more, so this is not all you're going to hear of this. So it'll take time perhaps to absorb some of this, and as we move through the course, we'll walk back through some of this and also look at how this can go awry, not just because things are, say, not put together well, but actually somebody's trying to deceive us, either through using equivocation on purpose for rhetoric or just propaganda.